Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of August of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Kursk direction. More precisely, we're going to talk first of all about the report that we received from the Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrsky. He stated that Ukraine, under Ukraine control, is around 1,150 kilometers and around 82 settlements of Kurshina. During the day, Ukrainian troopers advanced up to 1.5 kilometers also. So this is very interesting and of course very beautiful numbers considering the Ukrainian situation in Pokrovsk, in the Pokrovsk and other directions. But I would like to point your attention to the numbers not just of the 15th of August, but let's compare the numbers for 30th, 40th and the 50th of August of 2024. So as for the 30th of August, the Syrsky reported that the Ukrainians managed to advance for 1 till 3 kilometers along the line of combat contact. As for the 14th of August, according to Syrsky, the Ukrainians managed to advance for 1 till 2 kilometers along the line of combat contact in Kursk direction. And as for today, the Ukrainians managed to advance just 500 meters from 500 meters to 1.5 kilometers. So according to his numbers, according to the numbers that he provided today, the Ukrainian offensive operation in the Kursk direction is slowing down. Slowly, step by step, for another 500 meters per day, but the Ukrainians are getting slower and slower. So now let's discuss in details every single front, every single direction, and we will understand what exactly is happening and what the Ukrainians are planning to do next. But before we start, I would like to show you this video. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, right before we start making the video, published this small film, this small video of HIMARS that was attacking the territory of Russian Federation, the territory of the Kursk region. The Russians discovered the positions of this machine. The Russians start moving after the HIMARS, trying to find the location and where the Ukrainians are planning to hide this multiple launch rocket system. And later, the Russians attacked this territory with Iskander. And as a result of attack, the HIMARS system was destroyed. Now let's move to the ground. First, we're going to talk about the most southeastern direction. According to information we have, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians managed to have routed the enemy units and restored the control over Kupets. So the Russians were talking about this small village. I'll remind you that during the previous few days, the Ukrainians conducted a massive attack to Giri, and they managed to establish control over this small city for at least one day. But yesterday, the Russians restored control over this territory, and today, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians restore control over Kamyshne and over Krupets as well. So according to this report, we have adjusted the map, and according to this information, we can make a conclusion that currently the Ukrainians are located or try to dig in deeper in the vicinity of the village by the name of Spalne. During the day, we got reports that Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack the village of Borki, but the Russians are saying that most of the attacks were repelled by the Russians and the Ukrainians were forced to fall back. So summarizing everything about the south and eastern direction, we can make a conclusion that the Ukrainians lost their initiative completely, the Ukrainians lost their momentum, and now the Russians began the counter-offensive operation, forcing the Ukrainians to fall back. So this is very important. Now let's move further. And let's talk about the central direction, about the eastern direction, and about the city of Sudzha itself. As you can see, we have adjusted the map. We have added additional territory under complete Ukraine control because we have a lot of geolocations. In this video, we can see how the Russian soldiers, how the Russian FPV drone operators and Russian reconnaissance forces were following and were tracking the Ukrainian positions inside of the village by the name of Bandarivka. And then as a result of Lancet strike, the Russians destroyed Ukrainian vehicle exactly in this point. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map exactly in this part. This video confirms Ukraine control over this territory. Later, we got additional batch of the videos from the positions from the village of Mikhailovka. In this video, in these episodes, we can see a significant number of Russian FPV drone strikes and Lancet strikes on Ukrainian vehicles that were hidden between the buildings and, let's say, buildings, forests, and so on. This video confirms that there is a concentration of Ukrainian forces exactly on the territory of the village, and based on this video, we have adjusted the map. But the most important important that according to different mappers, according to different military experts, this village of Mikhailovka was captured by the Ukrainians a long time ago. Of course, not like months or years ago, but maybe 1 or 2 days ago. And today we just received the geolocations that confirms the Ukrainian edge positions. Based on these videos we've just discussed, we have added additional territory under complete Ukraine control. But the problem is that Ukraine offensive in the eastern direction also slowed down, and now the Ukrainians can't move further. They can't, let's say, leave the borders of Sudra. So the Ukrainians are blocked on the line between the cities of Martinovka, the village of Agronom, the village of Kolmakov, and the village Cherkasskaya Konopelka, and the village of Dmitrov. So this is most likely the line of combat contact, and since the beginning of the Kursk offensive, the Ukrainians made lots of attempts to break through this line, but they haven't managed to do this. So most likely the Ukrainians during the next phase of possible Kursk offensive operation are not going to move further in the eastern direction because they're blocked by the Russians from the east and from the northeast from the village of Soldatska, Большое Soldatskaya. Now let's move further and let's talk about the central part, the northern part, central northern part, and so on. According to information we have during the previous days, the Ukrainians made lots of attempts to attack the Russian positions to the north from Zhuravli, and for the previous 3 or 4 days in a row, the Russians were saying that as a result of artillery strikes, they were repelling additional Ukrainian attack, they were stopping Ukrainian offensive, and they were not allowing the Ukrainians to break through the Russian defense belt and to enter deep inside of the territory of Russia. So, and all these reports we've been receiving for the previous 3 or 4 days. And today the Russian sources published the photo of significant Ukrainian losses. And as you can see, just up to 12 or even more personnel carriers and light vehicles were destroyed by the Russians in the area of the village Safonovka. So summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion, the next conclusions. First of all, this territory is completely covered with the fog of war, because if you follow different mappers, nobody shows this territory as an area under complete Ukraine control. But according to the geolocations and according to the reports of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation and Ukrainian military experts, some of these villages are under complete Ukraine control. So, but another statement, another conclusion we can make is that Ukrainians during the previous few days suffered significant losses in this direction, and they lost their combat capabilities to move further in direction of Lvov. So, summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that the Ukrainians were stopped in this direction as well. So they can't move further. Very interesting details and updates are coming from the village of Zhuravli. If you remember, during the previous days we were talking a lot about geolocations that were discovered in this area. In this video the Russians destroyed or attacked at least 3 Ukrainian vehicles. This video was posted on the 12th of August. In this video that was published on the 14th of August, we can see another Ukrainian vehicle that was attacked by the Russian Lancet. So, and based on these videos we have adjusted the map and we have added this territory under complete Ukraine control. But the problem is that there is just one road that exists in this direction that Ukrainians can use to supply and support their forces. We're talking about this road. And today the Russian sources published very interesting video. This is it. More precisely, the Ukrainian sources published the video. And in this video we can see a series of FPV drone strikes on Russian vehicles, Russian tanks, Russian artillery systems exactly to the south of Zhuravli. And most likely this video confirms that after the Russians managed to secure the village of Kremenoye, the Russians conducted a series of counterattacks and basically they blocked the Ukrainians inside of Zhuravli. And currently there is, as I understand, there is a cauldron. Either the Ukrainians have already abandoned their positions in Zhuravli towards the village of Lyubimovka and Kruglinka, or the Ukrainians were encircled and now they're waiting when the main forces will unblock them. So let's follow this situation, because most likely this is the first cauldron during the Ukrainian Kursk offensive operation. Now let's move further to the west and let's talk about Koreniva. Since the beginning, since the first day of Kursk offensive operation, the Ukrainians made significant number of attempts to attack the city of Koreniva. According to different mappers, the Ukrainians captured the village of Volgovka, and according to some geolocations, the Ukrainians managed to reach the outskirts of Krasnooktyabrska, and the Ukrainians established control over the tree lines and the fortifications in front of the city. but yet the Ukrainians haven't managed to capture this small stronghold. So basically the Russians managed to stabilize the line of combat contact exactly along the railways and along the village. So that means that Ukrainians, maybe they will try to make more attempts to attack in this direction, but most likely everything will be repelled by the Russians. So summarizing everything, before we start with the final direction, we can make a conclusion that the Russians stabilized the situation in every single direction. Furthermore, as for the southeastern direction, the Russians have launched a counteroffensive and restored control over some villages. And as for the northern direction, the Russians also counterattacked the Ukrainians and probably managed to encircle the Ukrainian forces inside of the village of Zhuravli. And now we are moving to the western direction, and we are talking about the village of Snagast, Vishnyovka and Glushkova direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians published the video how they managed to capture the village of Nizapne. They thrown down the Russian flag and established the Ukrainian one. This video confirms the Ukrainian complete control over this territory, and furthermore, this video confirms that Ukrainians still have plans to move further in the western direction. And the thing is that during the previous 24 hours, the authorities of Kursk region reported and announced total and complete evacuation of the entire Glushkovsky region. So everybody will be evacuated from this area, not in a month, not in a year, but probably this upcoming night. People will abandon their positions, and probably for a very long period of time. And this report confirms that the Russians probably have reconnaissance and intelligence information that confirms that Ukrainians are planning to attack in the west, because the Ukrainians were failed in the southeast, they were stopped to the east, they were stopped in the northern direction, and now the Ukrainians understand the only possible way how to develop their Kursk offensive operation further is to establish complete control over the village of Glushkova, and after establishing control over Glushkova, the Ukrainians will be able to move in the northern direction towards the village or towards the city of Rylsk. Furthermore, as I understand, and according to reports we've been receiving since the beginning of Kursk offensive, there is still very powerful and big concentration of forces inside of the city of Glushkov, and most likely the Ukrainians will attack in direction of Rylsk from the east as well. So as soon as Glushkov falls, the Ukrainians will attack Rylsk from two directions, from the east and from the south. Furthermore, according to the reports we have, the Ukrainians have already destroyed the bridge in this area, and this was made to reduce possibilities of armed forces of Russian Federation to redeploy reinforcements and reserves inside of this area. Furthermore, of course, the Ukrainians are interested in destroying the bridge because they want to force the population and the civilians to stay in their towns and cities. So basically this is something like, not like Kursk offensive, it's more like big hostage operation by the Ukrainians, where they try to capture as many as possible civilians, military forces, soldiers, and then to use them to exchange for territories or maybe to blackmail the Russian Federation. So this is the situation, and as we can see, the bluff of Syrsky was exposed, and now we understand what exactly is going to happen during the next few days, weeks, or something like this. Furthermore, the Ukrainians continue bombing and attacking the city of Tyotkina itself. During the previous 24 hours, we got additional video how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian forces inside of the city, how the Russians were destroying the communication equipment, and most likely the Ukrainians are about to begin Tyotkina offensive operation as well. So, summarizing everything, the Ukrainians will conduct at the same time attack on the road Tyotkina, then Karavyakova, and then Glushkova. This is going to be the first attack, and Sudzha direction, and Glushkova from the east, the second attack. So two attacks in this direction. When the Ukrainians take under control this small city, they will begin moving to the north also, and they will include additional direction from Glukhov. And if the Ukrainians are able to do this, they will try to establish this line of combat contact, and then from this direction they will think what to do next. Either to fall back on the territory of Ukraine due to significant loss and critical losses, or to move further in the eastern direction towards the city of Lvov. So most likely this is exactly what is going to happen. Now let's move further in the southern direction. Today I have additional updates from Kolatilovka. The Russian sources published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces inside of this stronghold. I'll remind you that just yesterday the Ukrainians managed to establish complete control over this territory, and we were expecting that the Ukrainians would continue developing their offensive further in the eastern direction. But today, right before we start making the video, without any geolocations, without any confirmations, the Russians reported that they managed to restore control over this territory. So we are waiting for geolocations, and then we will adjust the map. Now let's move to Zolochev direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians began bombing the borderlands to the west of Pakros. The Russians discovered or continue discovering the concentration of or redeployment of the sabotage and reconnaissance group that the Ukrainians most likely are planning to send to the east to Pakros, and when the Russians discovered them, they start bombing and attacking them. So the Russians are just trying to prevent Ukrainians, to prevent additional attacks from the Ukrainian side. Now let's move to Kharkiv area, to the northern Kharkiv direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue advancing and continue attacking the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity and around the city of Liptsi. And for these attacks, the Russians were using additional forces and additional vehicles and so on. And as a result of offensive, the Russians managed to improve their positions along the tree line and to capture additional territories. Based on the geolocation, we have adjusted the map. Now let's move further. We will not talk about the northern Kupiansk direction or about the southern Kupiansk direction or about the Siversk direction, because during the previous 24 hours we haven't received almost anything. Most likely due to the critical situation in the Kursk direction, the Russians decided to redeploy forces exactly from these territories. And as soon as the Russians are able to stabilize the situation there, they will return the forces back. Now we are moving to the most interesting directions, to the area of the responsibilities of the group of forces center and the group of forces south. First, we're going to talk about Novgorodsk-Toretsk agglomeration. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were bombing and attacking the Russian forces almost in the most western part of Pivnichne. This video that was published by the 32nd Mechanized Brigade confirms Russian control over this territory. Based on this video, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps and added additional territories under complete Russian control. So according to this video, we can make a conclusion that the Russians control around 90% of Pivnichne, and the Russians are moving further in the western direction towards the coal mine by the name of Pivnichne. Now let's move further to the south. We have additional video that was published by the Russians, and the Russians raised the flag, and in this video we can see a Russian group of soldiers who stated that as a result of offensive operation they managed to secure the village, the city of Zalizne completely. And this is the city of Zalizne, and this video was added softly on map because I don't know for sure exactly this was made, and we still don't know and don't understand whether the Russians managed to secure Zalizne and the coal mine and the landfill to the west of the coal mine. Maybe the Russians managed to do this, but it's better to wait for additional geolocations to change the color of this territory. Now let's move to Novgorodsk or New York, and according to the reports that we received from the pro-Ukrainian mappers like Deep State and from neutral mappers like Syriac, we can make a conclusion that New York defense collapsed. The Russians managed to capture the most important and the most powerful and the most valuable regions of the city. The Russians managed to break through right between the industrial zone, the heart of New York, and the Russians managed to enter the high-rise building area in the northeastern part of the city. We're talking about this part. And now from this area, the Russians most likely established complete fire control over the roads that goes from New York itself to the north. And from now on, most likely the Ukrainians lost their possibilities to evacuate forces from the industrial zone to the north in direction of Konstantinovka. Summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that most likely the chances are more than 90% that the Russians also created a cauldron in this area. Currently, we don't know for sure the exact number of forces that were encircled, but most likely we are talking about a few hundreds of soldiers. And of course, most likely the Russians created a cauldron in the fields between Zalizne itself and New York as well. So the current distance between possible Russian edge positions in the high-rise building area of New York and Zalizne itself, the edge Russian positions, is less than 3.2 kilometers. So it's already nothing because, as you can see, there is an open air, and most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to move freely along these territories. They will be always under Russian fire, or Russian artillery fire, or FPV drone fire. And most likely, due to this configuration of the line of combat contact, most likely this upcoming night of the local time, of Ukrainian time, Moscow time, the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back towards Zabalovka and towards Toretsk itself. And we'll see. So most likely tomorrow we're going to receive additional update from this front line. Now let's move to Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians suffer significant problems. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions significantly, and the Russians are getting closer and closer to the city of Pokrovsk. Furthermore, the local authorities of Krasnoyarsk, Ukrainian name is Pokrovsk, is to announce the complete evacuation of the city. So this is a very big agglomeration. There are still lots of civilians, but the Russians are moving so fast, so we can start counting days when the Russians will reach the outskirts of Pokrovsk agglomeration. We're talking about Mirnograd and Pokrovsk itself. So as for the geolocations, according to information we have and according to the Ministry of Defense report, the Russians managed to secure and to clear Ivanovka completely. So the village is under complete Russian control. Furthermore, the Russians managed to move even further to the northwest, and according to different mappers, pro-Russian mappers, the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Novotoretska. This is a very small village, just few buildings, but this is also very important to understand the further Russian direction, the further Russian movements. So as you can see, now the Russians are focused to increase the same encirclement and of Toretsk agglomeration. Let's talk about the village of Vesele and the village of Grodovka. The Ukrainian sources during the previous 24 hours published the video of how they were actively droning and attacking the Russian forces inside of the city. This video confirms that the Russians not just answered the city itself, and the Russians established control over the high-rise building area that located in the southeastern part of the city. So we are talking about these small buildings. The Russians, as you can see, are advancing and moving further and further in direction of the bridges that located in the central part of the city of Grodovka. The Russians need to control the bridges. Of course, the bridges would be destroyed by the Ukrainians, but the closer they get to the bridges, the less reinforcements and reserves the Ukrainians are able to send to hold these positions. Very important progress. Now let's move to Novogrudovka itself. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians they announced the curfew has been introduced. Now the curfew will be in effect 20 hours a day. These rules will come into effect tomorrow, so on the 16th of August. That means that the city is under siege. The Russians are getting closer and closer from the north and from the south, and currently the distance between the Russian positions and Novogrodovka itself is less than 2.5 kilometers. The most important that is the city is located along the railways. This is the first important thing, and the second one is that there is a very big and powerful high-rise building area. Very big and very important citadel that located in the southeastern part. And if the Russians are able to take under control this city, this first stronghold of Pokrovsk agglomeration, then the Russians will be able to obtain a very powerful foothold for further offensive operation to the north, to the northwest, to the south, and to Selidovo itself. So this is like Acheretina. So we were talking a lot about Acheretina flower. And obviously, if the Russians are able to take under control Novogrodovka and Grodovka very fast, then we're going to start talking about Grodovka and Novogrodovka flowers that obviously are going to bloom, and they're going to bloom a lot. Now let's talk about changes on the ground. As you can see, we have a lot of territories that are contested and a lot of territories that were captured by the Russians with proofs. In this video, we can see the video of 25th Air Mobile Brigade of Armored Forces of Ukraine and how they were FPV droning the Russian soldiers exactly in this area. This video confirms the Russian presence, or maybe at least the control or the presence of the sabotage and reconnaissance group. Based on this video, we have adjusted the Russian positions in the village of Orlovka and Zhuravka. Later, we got additional video from the village of Mykolaievka. And in this video, we can see the movement of Russian personnel carrier with infantry on board. The personnel carrier was attacking the possible Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian drone of 47th Brigade was flying above, trying to understand where exactly the Russians are moving. And at some point of the video, the Russians stopped in the almost most western part of the village, which confirms complete control over the territory, or at least the presence of the Russians. This event took place here, and based on this video, we have adjusted this part of Mykolaievka. So as you can see, the situation is really and very critical. Furthermore, we got geolocation from inside of Zhelanne. Most likely the village was captured captured a long time ago, but yet we haven't received anything that can confirm this. Today we got just one video of how the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian soldiers exactly in between these buildings. So as you can see, we can make a conclusion that Ukrainians sacrificed Pokrovsk in Kursk favor, and they were thinking that the Russians would stop their offensive in Donbass, in Kupiansk, in Zaporozhye, Orekhov, and the Russians would redeploy a significant number of forces to Kursk area, but the Ukrainians, let's say, they failed, and they were wrong. The Russians didn't stop, they haven't stopped their offensive to Pokrovsk, and obviously this will lead to complete defeat of the Ukrainians in this direction. And the thing is that currently nobody can calculate the consequences for Ukraine, because if Ukrainians lose Pokrovsk, then there are no more defense or big cities or strongholds almost until Pavlograd and Dnipro and Zaporozhye itself. So after Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians should expect complete defeat and probably a lot of problems from the Russian side. Now let's move further. During the previous 24 hours, as you can see, the Russians continue publishing a lot of videos from the death roads. More and more vehicles were attacked by the Russian FPV FPV drone operators, and Ukraine suffered additional losses. Now let's move to the South Donetsk direction. The situation for the Ukrainians in this area is also very critical. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received geolocations that confirm the Russian presence on the Ukrainian side of the road TO524, but according to the 79th Brigade, the Russians are already on the Ukrainian side, and soon we're going to receive geolocations. And according to some sources, the Russians have already established control over more than 50 or 60% of the road TO524 between Konstantinovka and Ugledar itself. Significant progress, and most likely very soon we're going to start receiving the videos from Vadiana. The Ukrainians have the plan B. According to the Russians, the Ukrainians do have the plan B, and most likely they're about to use the plan B. And as for the plan B, according to information we have, the Ukrainians began concentration of forces in Orekhov direction. A lots of vehicles, a lots of fuel trucks are heading right now, or today on the 15th of August, towards the city of Orekhov. And after the Ukrainians finish the regrouping, and obviously they don't have much time, the Ukrainians will begin a full-scale offensive operation from Orekhov towards Melitopol. This is not like an attempt to capture all these territories. This is another attempt, the plan B, from Ukrainian side, to force the Russians to stop in the Pakros direction and to redeploy forces from here to here. But I'll remind you that Syrsky stated a few weeks ago, that the Russians concentrated additional forces in Zaporozhye. Probably the Russians also see and understand Ukrainian plans, and most likely very soon another battle is going to start in Zaporozhye direction. So Rabotina version 2 is about to begin. And that's it for the video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.